Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about my research. Finished my PhD at Oxford in theology on Dorothy L. Sayers and looking at her apologetic method and thinking about what we might be able to learn from that. So apologies in advance. Obviously, there's quite a lot of material to try and, encapsulate it in a short session together. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about that and then open things up for questions, if that's okay, rather than going into groups in this particular session. The way we're going to structure it is that I will give a sort of biographical introduction to Sayers, looking at her kind of theological formation as a child and young adult, and then look at her apologetic method through kind of three themes that I have identified. My methodology in the research was to read all of her work. So you may be aware the major genres she wrote in were the detective fiction, the whimsy novels, which some of you might have read, her religious plays. So she wrote a number of plays initially for to be shown in cathedrals. So thousands of people came and watched them on the stage. And then she wrote plays for the new media of the time, which was the radio, and millions of people heard those. So her detective fiction, her plays, then her essays. She wrote lots of essays and short lectures about all kinds of different themes. And then she wrote a book, which you may have read, called The Mind of the Maker, which was really addressing the sort of theological implications of the doctrine of the Trinity for an apologetic for the creative arts, if that makes sense, or from the creative arts to the Trinity and back. And then she also translated Dante's Inferno, the poem, into English for Penguin. So more people have read Dante because of her than anyone else. So that was a small little thing she did in later life. So she's very prolific, and then she wrote about 50,000 letters as well. So my methodology was to look at her genres and for the companion to that to be her letters, but asking the question, what was it that made her apologetically impactful? And so I was arguing for these three themes of truth, story, so narrative, and what she called pattern, which is about sort of structural coherence of reality. Okay, so that's where we're going to go in just a few minutes together. So we'll begin with a little bit of biography. So Sayers is probably most well known as the author of detective fiction. She wrote a number of novels. It's only really Sayers and Agatha Christie who are still in print today as detective fiction writers from the golden age of detective writing. So that says something about the quality of her work. She was a lay theologian and Christian apologist in her generation. So born in 1893 and died in 1957. That gives you the sense of her timing. She was an eloquent voice in her generation, articulating the Christian faith in an accessible and in a persuasive way. To give you a sense of her profile at the time compared to now, speaking of Sayers and C.S. Lewis, the then Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford, Canon Oliver Quick, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, in 1943, describing C.S. Lewis and Dorothy L. Sayers as the two people who seem really able to put across to ordinary people a reasonably orthodox form of Christianity. Karl Barth recommended Sayers to a student, calling her one of the most outstanding British theologians whose books he'd read in order to help him learn English. He went on to translate various of her essays into German. But whilst, C.S. Lewis has over 150 biographical and critical books written about him, full-length studies of Sayers can be counted on the fingers of one person's hand. She's been relatively ignored by the Academy. So a little bit of biography. Dorothy L. Sayers was born on the 13th of June 1893 in Oxford. Her father was ordained in the Church of England, and he was the headmaster of the Christ Church Cathedral Choir School in Oxford. He came from a long line of Church of England clergy and sort of followed that path as well. When Dorothy L. Sayers was 4, the family moved from Oxford to East Anglia. If you don't know the geography of Britain, it's the east of England. It's a sort of very flat, and it goes to it's east of Cambridge and a bit north, and it goes sort of to the coast. And it's very rural and not really the centre of culture making, shall we say. And she grew up in the vicarage there, surrounded by aunts, her grandparents and parents, and then staff who worked in the vicarage, but not really any children. And so she had an early interest in theology. She wrote a letter to her cousin when she was 13, discussing theology and science and discussing a sermon that her father had preached about reconciling science and the Bible. She said that she thought that most of the congregation listened with great attention, but 1 or 2 looked as if they'd got a tremendous new idea, and it had staggered them a wee bit, the idea that science and the Bible might in some way be able to come together. She wrote other letters to this same cousin called Ivy, discussing the salvation of people who've never heard the gospel and her concern about how you might reconcile that with the idea of a God of justice. The letters going back and forth really give an insight into a teenager who was quite deeply thinking about apologetic questions like that. She wasn't only concerned, though, about the salvation of people who haven't heard about God or the implications of science on the Christian faith. An important letter that Sayers wrote was to her cousin Ivy that reveals a bit more about her kind of personal journey with God and her concern for her friend and her cousin and her spiritual outlook. And she wrote this, and this turns out to be important a bit later. She wrote, "It seems to be an opportunity for me to say something that has been in my mind for some time, which I've never liked to say for fear of offending you. It is dreadfully difficult for me to say these things because I'm so much younger than you are, and yet I notice things and I feel I ought to tell you of them, especially of this thing, because I think if you aren't careful, it will spoil your life for you very much. I think that you are just a bit inclined to form a harsh judgment of other people. You are just a little inclined not to consider that some people may have quite peculiar temptations to put up with, which do not particularly assail you, and that some things which are easy for you are an awful fight for some others. I think this arises from the fact that you have rather a high moral standard, and if people don't keep up to it, you are a bit apt to condemn them. Dear old girl, get out of the way of thinking that. It is terribly closely allied to Pharisaism, which, as you know, is the one thing our Lord was always so down on. And I think this attitude towards other people will make you have fewer friends, because they will be afraid of you. I shouldn't like to feel, Ivy, that supposing sometime I sinned a great sin, I should be afraid to come to you for help. Only unless you would try to make allowances for me, I'm afraid I should. Charity is making allowances for others' mistakes." So she wrote that letter aged 13 to her cousin. In the light of what was to unfold in her own private life, this letter is strangely prescient, because Ivy was to be the one person Sayers would be able to turn to in her hour of desperation and need. So Sayers wrote an unfinished novel called Cato Mary, which was based loosely on her own childhood. And the main character, Catherine, is based, we know from the letters, on various incidents from her childhood. And I just want to give you one incident that kind of gives you a sense of the flavour of how the young Sayers was going to emerge into this amazing apologist and thinker. So Sayers and her governess had been in the vicarage garden searching for the tennis court, which had become completely overgrown. And Sayers used the geometric principles that she'd been learning in the schoolroom to locate the hidden tennis court in the unkempt garden. And this is how she writes about it through her character, Catherine. If the court had not been precisely laid out in the first instance, she might have had more difficulty, but the corner being accurately placed, the laws of geometry held good. In her heart of hearts, Catherine was awe-stricken. To see a prophecy made on paper fulfilled on the back lawn is a very enlarging experience. So this was an early experience of a pre-existing pattern being revealed in the specifics of life. The mundane lines of a tennis court took on tremendous symbolic importance because it was an experience of applying geometry to everyday life, revealing to Sayers that there is an intrinsic coherence to reality. An observation of ultimate truth being revealed in some tiny specifics of day-to-day life was for Sayers a religious experience. It was a glimpse of divine beauty, this overall pattern of truth being revealed in the particulars of a given instance. She wrote this: she had been brought face to face with beauty. It had risen up before her again, the lovely, satisfying unity of things, the wedding of the thing learned with the thing done, the great intellectual fulfillment. Nothing would ever quite wipe out the memory of the magnificent moment when the intersecting circles marched out of the page of the Euclid book and met on the green grass in the sun-flecked shadow of the mulberry tree. So Sayers was a deeply intellectual young person, and this interest in pattern and the coherence of reality was already emerging in her adolescent Christian faith. So as a schoolgirl, she did go off to school, to a boarding school, and in 1909 her father sent her a Greek New Testament that she promptly learned how to read and started studying with others at school. She was also sent G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, which she loved and wrote about how that kind of shaped her. So she actually was ill and had to come home, and then took her exams and took the exams for Oxford, and she won the highly prized Gilchrist Scholarship to read modern languages at Somerville College at Oxford in October 1912. So as a student, she flourished academically as well as socially, interacting with all kinds of friends. Her interest in the creeds of the church was piqued at Oxford, partly through the preaching in the church she went to regularly. And in 1915, she sat for her final exams in French honours, specialising in the medieval period, and she was awarded a first-class degree, which means you're sort of in the top 3 or 4 in the year. At the time, women at Oxford were only granted what was called a title to a degree rather than the honour of the degree itself. But that detail was settled in 1920 when Dorothy L. Sayers was among the very first group of women upon whom an Oxford degree was actually officially conferred. So she was a bit of a trailblazer. After studying at Oxford, she went to work in an advertising agency, and she got a full-time position. It was called S.H. Benson's Advertising Agency as a copywriter, and she was grateful for the regular work and the income that she got from that. But it was during that period of 9 years working in that agency that she wrote her detective novels in her spare time. And she discovered a gift for communication with the general public. She came up with advertising slogans like, "My goodness, my Guinness," you know, that horrible black drink people drink, the Irish thing. Well, that sort of slogan and that campaign is still known today in the English language. She came up with it. She also came up with the phrase, "It pays to advertise," which you may have heard of, and came up with other kind of creative advertising slogans around Coleman's mustard and other things. So in 1923, her first whimsy novel, Whose Body, was published, and she already had her second novel, Clouds of Witnesses, ready and waiting in the pipeline. But we get a bit of an insight into her frustration with working in advertising from a piece of dialogue that she included in another novel, Murder Must Advertise, which she set in an advertising agency. And she describes perceptions of truth in this world. And here it goes. The firm of Pym's Publicity Limited, advertising agents. Mr. Pym is a man of rigid morality, except of course as regards his profession, whose essence is to tell plausible lies for money. How about truth in advertising? Someone asks. Of course, there is some truth in advertising. There's yeast in bread, but you can't make bread with yeast alone. Truth in advertising is like leaven, which a woman hid in 3 measures of meal. It provides a suitable quantity of gas with which to blow out a mass crude of misrepresentations into a form that the public can swallow. So you can sense she was a tad disillusioned with the world of advertising and wrestling with truth and misrepresentation, perception, and the plausibility of lies. And that's actually something she really explores in her detective fiction, coming up with plausible lies that mislead the reader, which are a tremendous contrast then to the truth. And you can see how that might have been a significant paradigm for an apologist thinking about evidences and plausible stories which might explain reality but which actually turn out to be untrue. During this time in London, Sayers fell in love with the writer John Cornus. He was part of the Bloomsbury set, a novelist, and their love affair is documented in letters both about him and to him, which are surviving. But in essence, Cornus wanted to have a sexual relationship with Sayers outside of marriage and to use contraception so as to be sure that there would be no children. Sayers hoped not only to marry the man she loved, but also to bear his children. And as a committed Anglican at the time, her conscience wouldn't allow her to use contraception. Cornus was adamant that he would never marry anybody and he would never have children, and so they separated over the issue. On the rebound from this relationship, Sayers began a short-lived relationship with a motorbike mechanic, of all things. And because she neither loved him nor had any desire to bear his children, in despair, she ended up sleeping with him once, but did use contraception. But it failed, and she became pregnant with a son. Her misery was compounded upon discovering a few months later that Cornus had gone to America, got married, and was now going to have a baby with his wife. Apparently, he had wanted her to surrender her spiritual principles to him, and then he would have married her after all. So her letters to him in this period, which you can read, they're published today, you can see them, remove any sense of her as this sort of rarefied, cold, intellectual, unfeeling person. So an example is she wrote saying, "I'm afraid my hero worship was perhaps not quite so abject. I mean that though doubtless you feel that your company would be sufficient reward to compensate for any amount of spiritual filth, I'm afraid that if it excluded frankness and friendship and children and so on, it would be a maimed thing. You broke your image in my heart. You stood to me for beauty and truth, and you demanded ugliness, barrenness, and it seems now that even in so doing, you were just lying." She went on to say, "You're right in supposing that it is a husband I wanted because I'm impatient with the beastly restrictions which free love impose." And she famously wrote, "I have a careless rage for life, and secrecy tends to make me bad-tempered." So Sayers gave birth in secrecy to a son in 1923 on January the 3rd. Nobody knew she was pregnant. She hid her pregnancy in sort of large clothes, and people thought she'd got rather fat in the advertising agency, but no one knew she was pregnant. She gave birth alone. Her parents didn't know, and the only person she confided in a few days later was her cousin Ivy, to whom she'd written that letter. She was a professional foster carer, asking her to take the child on. This closed a spiritual and emotional circle since 16 years earlier. She'd written that letter. And so Ivy raised her son, John Anthony, and nobody ever knew that he was Sayers' son. until much later when the husband that she married, she confided in him. She suffered a good deal through this, and this may in part be why she didn't come to be more widely known. Her reputation as a theological thinker may have risen considerably further had it not been for this residual problem of keeping this secret. In 1943, on the success of her religious play, The Man Born to be King, published on the BBC, on the BBC, listened to by millions of people, the head of the BBC, Dr. Welsh, wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, asking whether a Lambeth doctorate of divinity could be conferred on Sayers, which would have been a huge honour, and she would have been the first woman to receive that honour. William Temple consulted various people, including the Professor of Divinity at Oxford, who I wrote about earlier, who agreed she would be worthy of both the academic and the kind of broader honour of it. But Sayers wrote in reply that she wasn't able to accept the offer. She said, a degree in divinity is not, I suppose, intended as a certificate of sanctity exactly, but I should feel better about it if I were a more convincing kind of Christian. I shouldn't like your first woman DD to create scandal or give review as cause to blaspheme. So she turned the honour down. Okay, in the intervening years, she'd written the Peter Wimsey novels, the essays, etc., the things that I mentioned. So let's think for a few moments together about her key apologetic emphases. Across her genres, and her genres are really different. If you've ever read one of her detective novels, there's no mention of Jesus or the gospel. It's not like the C.S. Lewis Narnia stories, which are kind of allegorical in any sense. So for some people, when she transitioned from writing the detective fiction to this kind of Christian speaker and writer, people thought it very, very strange. They had no idea from the novels that she was this great Christian. And then you have her writing poetry and writing essays and then writing plays, and then suddenly she's a translator of Dante. So multiple different genres, all of which seem to be very, very different. So what are some of the unifying themes and the key apologetic themes? Well, I think the first thing to say is that Sayers was not a philosopher. She was not a philosophical theologian. She didn't use language precisely. She was a woman of letters. She was literary, creative. She was a brilliant writer and thinker. And her work is entertaining, it's prescient, it's profound, it's insightful, but she didn't use language forensically like a philosopher. She didn't define her terms. And so it's important to bear that in mind as we think about these things. So let's first of all think about truth. Truth was central to Sayers' thought. And when she used the word, there were layers of meaning in it for her. In her work as a creative writer, Sayers envisaged truth as that which the artist imagines and communicates and reaches for, regardless of the art that they're creating. She felt that truth that was that which all genuine artistic endeavour revealed. So a true piece of art, whatever perspective it would be coming from, would reveal something true about the universe. Sayers viewed truth as critically important in the life of the writer. It encapsulated the goal of artistic creation. And then as a theological thinker, Sayers realised that truth might mean something slightly different. Her ideas were not only literary or creative, she had a theologically informed set of ideas about God and Christ, and these undergirded her understanding of truth. So the sense of Christ as the truth was not a narrow observation in Sayers' work. She believed this had universal purchase. She wrote, if Christ is the eternal truth, his coming should fulfill not merely the Jewish prophecies, but all prophecies, all the religious intuitions of man. Now, by that, she didn't mean that religious truth is plural or accessed plurally or syncretistically in some way. She contended that the truth about Christ would make contradictory religious beliefs totally incompatible. She believed Jesus was the only way, but she believed that all truth pointed to him, grounded in the person of Christ. And she argued that faith and truth often ran counter to an individual's personal preferences. She wrote, "Faith is not primarily a comfort, but a truth about ourselves. What we in fact believe is not necessarily the theory we most desire or even admire. It's the thing which consciously or unconsciously we take for granted and act on." And Sayers' convictions about Christ as truth were founded in her belief, her absolute conviction that truth had historical dimensions. And remember, she's writing in that period in history when German schools about the historical Jesus and the unreliability of the gospel narratives, etc., those were all rife and rampant, certainly in the Anglican Church. But she's saying the message of Christianity is that our vague feelings about right and wrong are quite true, that our vague dreams of a God in human form dying and resurrected are true. The thing did happen. It had an actual date in history. In her essay, A Vote of Thanks to Cyrus, Sayers described her surprise as a child at realising that there's a continuity between the religious sphere and actual history. She said it's just as well that from time to time Cyrus should march out of Herodotus into the Bible for the synthesis of history. So this sense that the Bible and history are on the same page. History is all of a piece and the Bible is part of it. So it really mattered to Sayers that the Christian faith was historically rooted and that truth was evidenced in history because God had entered history. She also sought to ground her ideas about truth more broadly by attempting to interact with the world of science. She wrote, "To the scientist, reason is valid, and your methods are valid as far as they go. God is truth, and any truth is God's truth." She wrote that before Francis Schaeffer. "There's nothing irrational about God, but you must not try to make scientific tools do something they aren't fitted to do. It won't tell you about origin or purpose." She saw no conflict between God's truth and science. She saw scientific discovery as part of this landscape of truth that would lead you ultimately to Christ. She believed in objective truth and the possibility of human minds accessing such truth by means of reason and logic. She understood truth to mean correspondence with reality, grounded in the existence of an objective supernatural reality, the Creator. She argued that truth is accessible to humanity despite the finite nature of our subjective experience because of the Christian concept of revelation. She said revelation is the only rational grounds for believing that our ideas about what is good correspond to any reality and are not just somebody's fancy. The Christian revelation is a record of experience, of story and action. So truth and reality are closely entwined in Sayers' mind. She welcomed challenge from philosophers like Kathleen Knott, and she engaged with Bernard Shaw and others' writings. She spoke about her frustration, though, with so-called kind of Christian communicators or theologians who didn't seem to be able to communicate truth in any kind of meaningful way to ordinary people, and who somehow gave people the impression that talking about God was inappropriate for ordinary people. She wrote, "They will treat God as an elderly invalid who might collapse from shock if suddenly intruded on by a common person. One of the lay apologists' great difficulties is the difference between the technical and the everyday meaning of words in the theological vocabulary. Over and over one hears preachers preaching merrily away and one wants to call out, 'Stop, stop! The words you're using don't mean to the people what they mean to you.' After a time, the people get to imagine that theological statements mean nothing at all, never did mean anything, and were never intended to mean anything. That's why it does seem to me that it may be useful for some common or garden person like myself to come along and say, 'Look here, this isn't just verbiage and mumbo-jumbo. It means something quite concrete and relevant. It applies in the most matter-of-fact way to my everyday experience. That's how Sayers understood truth. Well, let's think for a moment about story. So she was reaching for truth, passionate about truth, pointing to science and history and philosophy, correspondence with reality and such, to point people to truth, hoping that it might be possible for ordinary people to access truth in the Christian faith. And she also deployed this second important theme of story. So in her diverse work, story and truth are closely related. The connection between story and truth was significant for Sayers on a number of levels. But despite that, her observations about story, even in the whole sort of narrative theology movement or imaginative theology, she's not really referenced in the literature. C.S. Lewis noticed it's astonishing how little attention critics have paid to story, considered in itself. But Sayers put forward the potential power of story in exploring and communicating truth. She wrote that a well-written story produces a true and measurable effect, precisely as though it had in fact taken place within the work of art itself. She realised that a story enabled the expression of truth imaginatively in such a way that synthesis of word and image could communicate something deep about essential reality. Now, her observations about story were theologically grounded in her belief that truth and story were perpetually connected because God, the eternal truth, entered history in the incarnation of Jesus, and that was the ultimate story. And she wrote really powerfully about that. And she often spoke interchangeably of story and drama. So drama was kind of story enacted or incarnated on the stage, taking this sense of truth and story to another level. And she wrote that Christian dogma, truth about God, is the greatest drama or story ever staged. Reflecting on Christ, she said, it is the dogma that is the drama, not beautiful phrases, comforting sentiments, vague aspirations to loving kindness and uplift, nor the promise of something nice after death, but the terrifying assertion that the same God who made the world lived in the world and passed through the grave and the gate of death. Sayers argued that the incarnation in particular enabled humanity to see ultimate truth is grounded in story. And she sort of worked this out in lots of different ways, saying that even the specifics, the kind of particulars of a story, like the details of the plot or the drama, point us to this truth, that God isn't just this kind of abstract being, but that he's personal, revealing himself through story. The story has at its heart this incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, and that's historical, of course. But Christian redemption, viewed as story, was a sort of very central theme to Sayers. She argued that story isn't only relevant to human beings in the course of their own experience of life, but it also contains layers of truth being revealed, unfolding in history. And so she was the creator of stories herself, revealing or seeking to engage people with great truth, say through her detective fiction, and also showing how truth is revealed by evidence in those detective stories. But she also grasped the paradigmatic importance of story in the exploration and communication of the gospel. So we've got truth, we've got story, and then we've got pattern. Alongside Sayers' thinking and writing about truth and story, she frequently referred to this concept that she called pattern. Now, pattern represents the kind of unifying picture within which the pieces will fit, a picture or structure for truth that Sayers was committed to finding, revealing, and exploring. Sayers became committed to the sense that the Christian revelation is this kind of ultimate pattern that undergirds all meaning. She seems to have been shaped a little bit by this through G.K. Chesterton's work. In his book, Robert Louis Stevenson, Chesterton expresses his understanding of the concept of pattern when exploring human creativity. So it's definitely not a totally original idea to her, but it kind of shapes and undergirds her work and her apologetic. Throughout her work, she's exploring the possibility of recognizing truth within overarching structures or patterns. She wrote, "To build poetic systems of truth, the similarities must be not quantitative, but qualitative. And the new unity that will emerge will be a world of new values." Pattern is theologically and historically important because Sayers saw that Christ entering the world was the defining pattern for meaning for humanity. And she wanted to perceive pattern and to be shaped personally and creatively by that true pattern, if you like. She also wanted to point to it as an apologetic, to show people, look at this structural coherence of reality, and doesn't that point to God? Sayers was clear that her understanding of pattern and the kind of ensuing coherence of reality didn't necessarily imply determinism. It didn't mean that God has everything mapped out on a sort of rigid pattern. She envisaged it more as a bicycle wheel, and there being spokes going into the hub. And she spoke of an author writing a story and the characters being a bit like the spokes of that bicycle. But as the story progresses, they converge on the hub of the wheel. So the possibilities of what that character within the story might do begin to limit as we know more about the character. So what's feasible for them, how the plot will unfold, becomes limited and limited and limited within the wheel until it converges on this hub of what actually happened. And so she's saying it's not necessarily a kind of deterministic way of looking at the world. So pattern for Sayers meant that Christian dogma could provide a coherent foundation for reason, for goodness, for all kinds of other widely held assumptions. She wrote, Christianity asserted that the things which man had believed about right and reason from the beginning of the time were neither idle dreams nor wishful thinking, but actually and earthily true. It claimed, in fact, that man's persistent belief in goodness and reason were justified, that such was the nature of God and the true nature of man, and that Christ was there to prove it. Christianity offered the actual physical fact of the incarnation. Christianity took theology out of the realm of myth and allegory and pegged it firmly down to history. It picked up, so to speak, all the scattered ideas about God and man and the universe which had been lying about like loose beads, beautiful but disconnected, and ran through them like a string the historical personality of the God who made flesh. So Sayers envisages this necklace with the string being the incarnate Christ in history, pulling the beads into a coherent shape that was in fact a pattern. The specifics of Christ in history enacted a true pattern upon which actually Western civilization was built and even able to flourish. And she was bemoaning the fact that intellectuals were now seeking to do away with Christ, the very historical string holding the beads together. She said it is the pattern of those beads on that string that is the pattern of our own civilization and culture. We've grown accustomed to the look of it. We've spent 19 and a half centuries polishing the beads. And during that time, we've been tempted to feel that the only thing that spoils the look of them is the ugly string of Christian doctrine running through them. For the last 3 centuries, we've been snipping the string away, strand by strand, forgetting that it was the string that made the pattern in the first place. Let us be quite clear about that. The assumptions we take for granted about right and reason, which seem to be self-evident, are not self-evident at all. The evidence for them is the evidence for Christianity, and if we reject the one, we automatically lose the other. What we've been trying to do for some time is to keep the Christian ethic without the connecting thread of Christian theology, the beads without the string. We can, of course, hope or imagine that the pattern will hold together of its own accord, but we have no rational warrant for supposing that it will. Indeed, the witness of history contradicts that supposition. Sayers envisaged pattern as a string through a necklace, as the architectural blueprint for a building, as the kind of internal skeleton of a person, or even as the pattern on a carpet, where threads are kind of randomly woven together, and then you go round to the other side of the loom and you discern, you see a pattern. So it was about structural coherence. So in her Apologetics, she's weaving together that big picture question of coherence and meaning and reality, the specifics of stories that show us something about truth, and very particularly the truth of the incarnation of God in history in Jesus, but all kinds of other stories leading us to the truth as well. So that was her kind of methodology. I want to leave some time for questions, but let me just briefly touch on the detective fiction and then on one of the essays, and then we'll open these for questions. So this early concern or interest with story and truth and pattern can be seen in her initial choice of the novel, a story, as the form of her art. So in her detective novels, readers are drawn into a story and they're persuaded to attempt to discover the truth of a particular matter. And this happens by evidences being pieced together within an idiomatic pattern that makes sense amongst competing explanations. Recognition of the pattern is the paradigm for discovering truth. The reader experiences the frustration of piecemeal evidence leading us down blind alleys, or imposter stories that don't fit the pattern and can never lead us to the truth. In Sayers' presentation of plot, evidence needed to be pieced together in a big picture. Things would not make sense outside of that structure of the true story. There was a singular pattern within which the pieces would fit and everything could be explained. You can see how that overlaps with the work of an apologist. And then in Gaudy Knight, her most famous novel, we see at the end of that novel that there is no available alternative end to the story. The evidence has come together within the pattern and truth has been discovered. But there is a really crucial prerequisite for it being possible to discover truth within pattern and story. And the prerequisite is the intellectual integrity of those pursuing truth. That's what Gaudy Knight is exploring, reminding seekers of truth of our own vested interests, of the things that blind us, the personal cost to discovering truth that may be uncomfortable or inconvenient to us. So it is possible that vested interests might actually prevent us from following the truth, accepting the pattern that makes sense of all the pieces. There's a kind of gospel challenge in there, subtly. We could talk about her religious plays, which were controversial because she took the words of Jesus from the gospel and took them out of the sort of King James Version, this very sort of religious sounding, you know, how the Bible was read in those days, with sort of clerical sounding voices, and put the words of Jesus and the disciples into the mouths of ordinary sounding people. It caused headlines, it caused scandal. You know, there was this big headline in the press saying, you know, blasphemous play using US slang on the radio, which wasn't at all what happened, but it actually gathered a lot of interest around the play and meant that millions of people heard it, and millions of people were shaken to the core hearing the words of Jesus spoken by an ordinary person without a weird religious tone of voice. And if you look at the statistics around church attendance in the 1940s and 1950s, there's this fascinating spike in numbers of people professing Christianity. And these plays were seen as at least a part in causing a major cultural shift in the UK, people coming to know Christ. So that vision of, through story, the pattern being revealed, one of the ways she did that was through those plays. And then just finally coming into land, her essays. I think one of her most powerful pieces of work was writing these short essays. You can read them. There's a volume called Unpopular Opinions, which is very good. And there's another one called Begin Here, which has lots of short essays by her. She famously wrote 3 essays about work, one called Living to Work, one called Why Work, one called Vocation in Work. And they really explore a Christian kind of apologetic through work. And then she wrote 2 essays about women, 2 essays about what it means to be a woman. She publicly addressed questions about the role of women through her life, but she wrote these 2 essays focusing on this question in 1938. And the first essay is rather poignantly called Are Women Human? The second essay is called The Human Not Quite Human. Sayers, in these essays, is exploring the position of women in culture, in society, and what the gospel has to say to that question. And she was resisting the tendency of second wave feminism to resist sexism by creating women as a sort of special class of people. And Sayers argues that that kind of feminism is a sort of reductionism. You're actually reducing women to being a subcategory of human. And what the Bible says is that male and female together carry the image of God. She develops this thought really, really powerfully. I think it's really relevant still today. But at the end of her second essay, she comes into land on this question of what it means to be a woman and what the Christian gospel has to say to this massive question in culture and society. And she brings it into land on Christ. She begins by saying, perhaps it is no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man, and there never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged them, never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There is no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words of Jesus that there was anything funny about a woman's nature. She spoke of Jesus as God incarnate, revealing both the ultimate pattern of truth in its specific outworking in history and society and in the church, and called people to reconsider their treatment of women in the light of this. It's very, very powerful at the time, and I think still today. So Sayers famously came to know God through what she described as her love of the intellectual pattern of the Christian faith. the dogmatic and doctrinal pattern expressed in the story of Christ, and particularly the Incarnation. And it's this irresistible interplay of pattern and story that gave rise to what she described as the passionate intellect, a passion for truth that is everywhere manifest in her work, and was so attractive to people who engaged with her apologetic. She spoke cogently and persuasively in her generation and became the most effective female Christian apologist of the English-speaking world in the 20th century. The end. Okay.